Thank you so much for joining us. I'm the Minister at EPC, David Nicholson, and tonight I'm thrilled to be joined by Jen Pollock Michel, who's my guest. Jen is a writer. She's currently based in Canada, and she has written, I have to say, an excellent work called Keeping Place, which is what I will hope to be some of our conversations around tonight. This is one of her books. I've been a fan for a while. I've enjoyed it. It's basically a theology of home. Reflections on the meaning of home is actually the subtitle. So I hope to talk to Jen tonight about some of the big topics in the book, and there's a lot. I'm excited for it because we all have a home. We all have somewhere that we considered home, or we've all had interesting relationships with the idea of home. So Jen, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And why don't you start by, if you like, introducing yourself to us and tell us a bit about your Christian journey and background, and what led you up to writing this really thought-provoking work?
Yeah, this book really comes out of my own sort of story of home, which is a long story, and I won't bore you with all of the details, but just to tell you a little bit about, you already mentioned, David, that I live in Toronto. I'm actually an American immigrant here, and we came to Toronto in 2011 for a work experience for my husband, and just ended up falling in love with the city and deciding to stay. And then, of course, that throws the question of home like totally up in the air, especially when you live away from home for so long. I mean, is home Chicago, like the place where we left, or is home Toronto, the place that, the ground under our feet right now? And I think it's just that story of feeling like I'm not even sure where home is, but I know that I long for it. And so I think the question of home, like our longing for it, is really sort of in Keeping Place. It's sort of a driving question in Keeping Place. Like, how do I understand this longing? As far as my Christian journey, I was blessed to be raised in a Christian family. And we were one of those families that went to church 3-4 times a week. We were very good Baptist. And I also was that teenager who was like, I believe in Jesus. I just really am not very interested in following him right now. I sort of thought that Christianity meant like your life had to be super boring. And I thought, I'll come back to Christianity. I'll come back to following Christ when I'm like 30 and my life is boring anyways, because I'm probably driving a minivan and I have, kids who are eating goldfish in the back. But as you know, we don't always plan our conversion stories. And I was 16 and happened to be at camp with my youth group, and just, I would say, had an encounter with the living Christ. And just who, at that point, I feel like I remember the questions of, what do you want? Where are you headed? And will you follow me? And it just, it seemed very obvious at the time, like, yes, I absolutely will follow you. And so that's kind of the story of my faith journey. And I think it's a story about the longing for home, really, too. I think I take so seriously the fact that Jesus says in John that, as we love him and obey him and love the Father, like the Father and he will come to us and they're going to make their home with us. And I feel like the gospel explains how we long for home, and how also, what it feels like, what it means to be homesick. And then that's another part of my story. Loss is a huge part of my story. My dad died when I was in my first year of university, and my brother committed suicide a year out of university. And so, I've got those stories of loss too, that make me think about just the deep longing for stability in the world. And I know that the human experience often doesn't afford us that.
That's so interesting that you characterize it in those terms, because often there's a debate. I remember when, and I can't, and it's not right ever to equate losses, but perhaps we can share some experiences. When I lost my grandfather on my father's side, who I was deeply close to, they lived out in the country, and I would spend weekends with them. Well, lost them was a real huge hole in my life, and the place where we spent time with him had enormously rich memories in their home. And I remember going there a couple of times after my grandfather passed away and my grandmother was in Cairn. I remember thinking, we loved this place, but man, it was empty and it didn't feel good and it didn't have the same resonance. I remember my mother saying to me at the time, it's the people that make places. But there's something about places too. And I just find that so interesting. So you've obviously really had to think through that home. Is it where the people I love are, or is it something more than that?
Yeah, when I think about home, especially in the book, I looked back at the garden. It was just kind of that template for the first home that God made. And I think we can think of God as a homemaker, and I think it's easy for us. And I hear a lot of people saying, well, home, it's not the place, it's the people, just as you were saying. But when you look at the garden, it really is both, it's both the place, the garden that God has made, and it's the people that he's put in that garden. And I think that's why we do have such a longing for being connected to places and people. I mean, obviously, if the place didn't have the people, it wouldn't be meaningful, wouldn't feel like home. And, you can do that. Like actually, even for the book, I went back and visited some of these addresses that I had lived at. And of course, it feels so kind of empty because it's just the house that you used to live in, but it's not at all the home that you used to have, because you don't live there and the people that you love don't live there. I mean, it's the same address, it's the same place. But I really do think that, to think about home in the most meaningful way that we can, it really does need to be both. It's actually work too. That was a part of the vision of the garden, is not just that it's a beautiful place filled with all the people that you love, but you actually have a meaningful vocation there. You have a vocation, you have work that is part of your worship. So there's a lot of different aspects of home. And I think you can really sort of tease those out from Genesis 1 and 2.
Yeah, I love that. The amount of good stuff you've mined there from Genesis 1 and 2, because I don't know about you, but I certainly grew up and I grew up in church culture too, the vast majority, for which I'm deeply grateful. It gave me the roots that I have. But Genesis 1 and 2 was, I feel in the time I was growing up, used primarily as the grid or the textbook of where the world came from and who created it and who's in charge. And, none of that stuff are things that I would question now. But it sounds to me as if you have managed to unpack some of the deepest recurring experiences of what it is to be a human being. You have found right back there, and you've almost found like a whole, or you've certainly enjoined previous traditions in the church where you found an entirely new complexity of the idea of home in Genesis 1 and 2, on top of all the stuff that's there about where we came from.
Well, I don't want to claim that I did that all on my own. I mean, I'd have to really sort of flip through the bibliography, because I know that there were a lot of people that informed that kind of vision. And one person that I think of in particular was Craig Bartholomew's, I think it's Where Mortals Dwell. And he has this whole idea of kind of talking about the creation, fall, redemption narrative, like through the lens of place. And I think that was sort of what originally kind of drew me to the idea of, could we tell the entire gospel story through the lens of home? And I connect more with the word home rather than just place. I mean, I think place is a wonderful starting point, but I don't think it has all that affective dimension, that idea of real longing, like our sense of kind of emotional connection and desire. And I think that's what we really want to tap into when we tell the gospel story. There's another quote that in the book that has just always resonated with me. And it's John Perkins, who was a civil rights activist in the US. And he said, the job of the evangelist is to connect the good news with people's deepest longings. And of course, like my first book was just about desire and longings. I mean, that I feel especially attuned to that, this idea of like how do we talk about our longings? And then how do we talk about those as Christians that connect the gospel with those longings? And I think home, I mean, I think, that's where the biblical story begins. And I think that's where it ends too. And when we get to the end of the story, we think about just all of our longings for a place of permanence, of welcome, of something that's immutable and not subject to change or decay, where we're going to have that. And what an amazing hope to share with the world. I think also my literary background makes me think about home. There's a literary critic who talks about the novel as like a form of, it's just the main theme of the novel, he says, is homelessness and homesickness. And I think that's really true. I think that in fact, my kids they get really sick of me. Whatever book project I'm working on, it's like I can only see things through that lens. And so every movie we would watch, every book we would read together, I'm like, see, it's a story about home. It's a story about how we long for home and how we feel estranged from home. I mean, if we could really sort of look out into the world and think about the ways that people feel so deeply estranged from a place that guarantees safety and welcome, and hospitality, and just to be able to say to them, I can help you make sense of that.
Yeah, and I think that I love the way you stumbled onto the fact that historically writers and artists have done a great job of understanding that this is a deep human desire. My own culture, as we were talking a bit before the show, is as a Gael, somebody who comes from the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, and a Gaelic speaker. And we actually, I don't know if you've ever come across this in your research, and I hope to do some writing on it in my own academia later on, but we have a word for homesickness in Gaelic called Cianalus. But it's very, very difficult to translate into, it has no direct parallel in English. So it pulls together ideas of homesickness, but also longing and desire, and a deep sense of sorrow. So some of our great works in Gaelic song and poetry come out of, for instance, those who in the 18th and 19th century would emigrate to Canada and the United States and Australia and settle and make a new life there, but retain that deep sense of longing for home. Or indeed many of our war poets or deep sea poets, they talk about this Cianalus because it's almost a huge part of our culture now, actually, particularly our artistic works. And I wondered if you have come across that in your own research, and also if you think there's some tie-in there for, and if I would like to set this up to talk about the fact that the Genesis 1 story where we were planted and placed, that we're not there anymore. Does that have some overlap for us as humans?
Absolutely. This is why homesickness is the human condition, because humanity began in a place where they were rooted, as you said, and planted and in right relationship with one another and with God. And all of that, we've been set essentially to wander in the world. Even those of us who may feel deeply connected to our geographical places, we still have a sense of of estrangement, because those places are subject to change and to decay. They never stay exactly the same. And so I think you're absolutely right that, when you think about the immigrant experience, the refugee experience, this really is to describe all of us. We all are estranged from our primordial home. And that's why when we try to satisfy our longings for home, primarily kind of in the horizontal realm, it never works. It never fully achieves that kind of deep sense of rest and welcome and belonging. I think belonging is a word that people really understand today. We all sort of seem to be searching for a place of belonging. And it's interesting, when you think about like social media and how it's cultivating kind of this sort of niche experience of belonging. Well, I can go and find my people who love my thing, and it totally disconnected from geography. And so you can see that kind of appetite to belong to. In that sense, it's not a place, it's a community of people who share similar affinities. I think as Christians, we get to help people sort of name what that is, and name also why their desire for belonging is not ever going to be fully fulfilled in this world. And what an incredible amount of freedom. I mean, and it's not a carelessness, and it's not an indifference to place at all. In fact, I feel like this whole search for home and this trying to sort of understand the gospel through the lens of home has actually led me to reinvest incredibly deeply in my place. But with a kind of an open-handedness, with a real sort of sobered sense of what this world can give me. Like, I'm thankful, to have a home and to have a family. And I believe those to be good gifts from God. I'm thankful to be almost now 10 years rooted in a city, and a real sense of like, I not necessarily even that I belong here, but that I'm invested here. But I also know that those things they're not ever going to last. I mean, if I put all of the weight of my hopes on my marriage, well, who's to say, that tomorrow something changes? I mean, we're in the middle of a pandemic. Who's to say what might happen to any one of my children? Who's to say that what might happen, like that, tomorrow we lose our jobs and we can't pay the mortgage, and we're not actually in this physical house. And so there's this incredible freedom that we experience as Christians to love our places, to invest deeply in them, but not to hope, in them excessively, to sort of hold them with open hands.
That's really interesting, because I think that in Christian history, you see so much on both sides of those ditches. So I certainly grew up with the text and the sermon title a lot of, here we have no continuing city. So if you enjoy where you are too much, then perhaps you're not that good a Christian. You're a bit too materialistic.
Yes.
And the sense of place is a wonderful corrective to that. But then also, dare I say that what we see a lot of in our world now is, can you have a fixer-upper project that is the ultimate Instagrammable home? But yes. Then a natural disaster could take that away. So no, you don't have a continuing city. So how's that been for you, your own journey of trying to find the balance there, and how important has Christianity been for that?
I mean, in some sense, because my story is shaped by loss, it's almost like inscribed in my DNA that I understand how everything is sort of short-lived. I mean, and that sounds like it could be incredibly pessimistic. And I actually don't think that it is. Like, I think it's one of those severe mercies of God to learn early in your life that the things of this world do not last. And, when you think about Jesus, and at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, where he says to people like, there are people who build on the rock and there are people who build on the sand, and the rain is going to come down on both of those houses, and only one will stand. And so I feel like to be a Christian and to know what it means to build on the rock, I mean, what an incredible hope. If I build on the sand of things that could instantly change, it means my hope is incredibly fragile. Anything could disappear, tomorrow. If I build my hope on the rock, on things, on Jesus Christ, who is the same yesterday, today, and forever, that means I'm free to enjoy the things of this world. But again, like I said, with open hands. And so, it's funny because there were so many liminal years actually here in Toronto. So I'm sort of experiencing like a sort of second half to Keeping Place, if you will. I mean, second Keeping Place is so much a story of just a longing for permanence. We were constantly, just for like 6 to 7 years, we were saying like, are we staying in Toronto? Are we going back to Chicago? Where is home? And then we finally became permanent residents in Canada, and we bought a house. And so it felt like we actually were sort of rooting ourselves here. And so we're enjoying that phase of feeling rooted, which I feel like is a way that it's a call to investing, in a place. So once you kind of, so long as you don't belong to a place, I don't think you feel responsible to a place. But as soon as you sort of say like, okay, I'm going to lay claim to belonging, then you have to lay claim to responsibility. And I can remember actually the summer day that like things sort of shifted for me. My children and I were walking in the neighborhood, and there was this crazy driver who came by, and she swiped one of my neighbor's cars, and she just flew off. And I was like, what just happened here? And like if let's say that wasn't my neighborhood, you know how you'd be like, well, that was crazy, and walk on. And it was the first time where I thought, no, I live here. Like, this is my neighborhood. And I chased after the car, and I got all the information from the car. And then I walk it back to my neighbor and said, this is the person who just swiped your car. I don't, but again, it's that sense, like, I think it's easy to be transient. And I think it's actually easy to spiritualize that. Like, this world is not my home. But this world is not our home, but the ground under my feet is where I live right now. And that's the only patch of the world that I can really care about in a significant way. And so I think just stepping toward that really matters. C.S. Lewis said it, so beautifully. He said, the people who do the most for this world are the people who think most of the next, And so it's that eternal perspective, that kind of vision of the home that God really meant for the world to be, that informs how we live now.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, I love that. And it's actually taken us almost full circle back to Genesis 1 and 2, where Adam had a job to do. He had gardening work to get on with. So maybe the way you and I learn to apply that is to get stuck in with whatever the ground under our feet is, our local communities and the church we're a part of, or whatever that is. And I also think that's a really helpful vision for just now, where there's nothing very grand we can do beyond home. And actually, I wanted to ask you about that. Have any of your reflections on Keeping Place been altered by home? Because I'll be honest with you, home is now become a more complicated relationship with me, between having to work at home and having small kids at home in a global pandemic. This is definitely not natural. And my offering would be, I don't think it's very like the garden in terms of rhythm and what we're made for. But yeah, how does home look theologically through the lens of COVID-19?
Well, on the one hand, I love that everybody now is spending more time at home, and they're actually looking around and going, I should think about making this place a little bit more livable. We often live in our homes in ways that we just kind of dump things. I don't know. We don't think about kind of the beauty and livability of our homes. And now that everybody's home, it's sort of like the immediate question, what should I do? And that's already something that was a work that I was already engaged in. And that's not about buying a whole bunch of stuff. It's really just about sort of recognizing where you live as a place to be tended, as like a garden, just your own garden that God's given you to tend. I think the hardest thing for me is not having any ability to show hospitality. I mean, that is really how we live out of our home. We have a big dining room table. I mean, we've had it for, I don't know, since the twins actually were 1.5, because I can remember when one of them banged their fork on my brand new table. I'm like, no, just to see all those empty chairs around the table, to be facing the holidays and thinking about what I would normally be doing is thinking about all the stragglers, the people who are like me, transplanted into the city, maybe not able to get home. So I'd be gathering those people. And now I can't. And so I sort of feel like, what do I do now? How do I show hospitality when I can't actually have people inside of my home? And here's a really fun just cool thing that God's given me, just a phrase that is sort of orienting my perspective right now. I've been doing a little bit of research on these medieval religious women who lived in communities. They're called the Beguines. And I don't think actually this was particular just to them. I think it was a medieval church practice. The funds that they kept for the poor, they called the table of the Holy Spirit. Isn't that just, I just love that, because I think about table being so central to a vision of home. I mean, it's a vision for God's home, because like, well, in the new city, the new Jerusalem, we're going to be feasting, this table is kind of central to that vision. So I can't gather people around my table now, but could I share gifts from the table of the Holy Spirit? Who are the kind of the poor and the lonely, the isolated, just right around me. I mean, it's not far. It's across the street. It's Gail across the street, whose husband died in the spring. She's like in her 80s. They were married for 60 years. I mean, I think it could be something as simple as just going over there and dropping off soup when I have some extra that I've made, over the month of December. It could be these very simple ways that I just sort of say, I offer something to somebody, and then I also say to them, this is a gift from the table of the Holy Spirit. And, and I'm going to say, I totally will say that to people who don't know Jesus. And I know they'll sort of look at me like, and then I'll say, oh, that's a little something that I learned about medieval Christians, that they would try to express generosity and just, in the world, and they would talk about the table of the Holy Spirit and how God was, demonstrating his goodness in the world. I'll say something like that, and they'll look at me like, okay, I'm okay with that. But that to me gives me a little bit of hope that, the work of home is ongoing. God's got a table. He's feeding people from it, even if it's like not actually in my dining room.
Sure, and still inviting people too. It sounds like your reflections on home have, massively developed outwards in terms of home is not only the place that we cultivate and fulfill that mandate from the garden, but it's also the place where we get to extend the kingdom, because we've made such a good job of cultivating it that it's somewhere other people can be invited that is got some of the hallmarks of what's considered a good home. It's welcoming and it's safe and it's secure and people can be absorbed there. Would that be a fair
That's absolutely, like, I actually, one of the titles that I had for the book that my publisher was like, no, was like The Witness of Home. Like, cause I think it's a story that is, it's a way we can bear witness to what reality is. I think home is not just something that we like privately cultivate for, our good and the good of our families. That's a wonderful part of it. But I really think about home as this kind of witness that we bear in the world, the story that we tell people that connects like their longings with the good news of the gospel, and something that we invite people into. So I am very active, like in my neighborhood, just trying to notice what, the people who live right around me, notice what they might need, try to learn and listen to their stories. And, we had a wonderful sermon this last week at our church about just the sower and the seeds, just he's scattering seeds. He goes to bed, the seeds grow and he knows not how, Mark chapter 4. And that's kind of how I think about the work in my neighborhood. It's just like, I try to scatter seeds, it's conversations here. It's a small gesture of kindness there. A little gospel seed there, I'm bearing witness to something God's doing in my own life. And then I'm going to just let God grow those as he wills.
I love the extent to which your reflections, they almost, this is what I find as a pastor anyway, that the gospel itself even is endlessly deep. It is not less than Christ dying for our sins, but it's so much more than that. And you keep finding all these great nuggets of brilliance as to, the gospel makes sense of that part of life. And what an exciting way to, because sometimes I find that Christians aren't always sure how to explain their faith in the gospel and invite people into it. But if you turn that on its head and take the simple idea of you're at home with God, why not make your life about inviting others to be at home with God?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Um, what about the down in the, if you like, the nitty gritty of home in your book, and I know some of this already, but I'm really interested in you talking about it, is you talk about things like the idea of the liturgy of home, um,
Mm-hmm.
and how there's a huge spiritual component to what we think is ordinary about home. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I try to tease this out in the book, and I don't know if I did a decent job or not. I think I probably didn't do a decent job, but I still keep talking about it. In fact, I'm writing an essay about it right now. Just the idea of like, if you have a home, you have to care for that home. So if you have a home, you also have housekeeping, and I actually really like the word housekeeping as we to kind of describe the way that we are meaningfully and very ordinarily involved in the world, in God's work in the world. Um, I think that often we think about our lives like in terms of like the cosmic gesture. Everybody wants to have a life that feels significant. We want to do things that feel really meaningful and purposeful. And so we often look for kind of the dramatic and the extraordinary. And when we think about like, when I use the word like the rituals of home or the housekeeping, what I mean is to kind of like, almost like the more modest aspirations, the sort of everyday work of loving people, of serving people, of welcoming, of making your life hospitable. Again, when you think about those kind of rituals, like when I just walk my neighborhood, I mean, a liturgy of home could be something simple as just trying to stop and talk to people and look to them, like look at them, listen to them, ask them interesting questions. That actually fascinates me. I think if Christians like just took up the ministry of listening, we couldn't even imagine what God would do with that, especially in COVID. I actually invited my neighbor over this summer, like kind of towards the end of the summer. They had been away. They have a cottage and they had been back, and I hadn't really seen her in the yard. So I said, just come over for coffee and we'll drink in the back. And about 2.5 hours, like she just literally just kind of like disclosed like fears and anxieties and worries and just everything about this moment. And she actually sent me an apologetic text like later in the evening. She said, I guess like I really needed somebody to talk to. And I thought that was just so easy to do. It was so easy. Like all I did was just offer a cup of coffee and just sit there and like just try to ask follow-up questions. And like that's a liturgy. It's a ritual, but it's of the ordinary kind. Like that's not a dramatic gesture. I didn't do anything that like really altered kind of the course of world events. I just tried to make the person who lives right next to me, make her feel like someone was interested to hear what she was struggling with. And so I like the word housekeeping too. When I think about just all these kind of, I'm talking about the rituals, the kind of ordinary everyday habits that we have of like just being good neighbors, good parents, good spouses, good friends, good daughters. I like that word too because it sometimes feels tedious. That work can feel tedious. It's actually not work that you always want to do. So there was a phone call that I had to make right before this call, and it was of the housekeeping sort of phone call. It was a person that I just need to touch base with, that I know it's going to sort of feel like the same conversation. It's not necessarily going to fill my soul, make me feel good, but it's a person who just needs to know that they're loved and somebody in the world is thinking about them. And again, I didn't offer any amazing advice to this person. I didn't fundamentally change what is a very anxious time for them. But I just thought, well, I'll probably try to do it again next week. Housekeeping are the things that you do with some regularity. And I think one word I've been thinking about a lot in the pandemic is endurance, the Christian virtue of endurance, of just staying with something, sticking something through. And I think love requires a lot of endurance. Like in that word also suggests to us, like, we have, like, when there's hardship, you have to just keep persevering in it. I think we give up on a lot of things when they don't, like, kind of feel good, when they don't make us actually feel like we're contributing in some way. Um, so those are the kinds of things that I want to call people toward, and not just people. I want to call myself towards that, because I know that I resist that. I resist kind of the kind of just ordinary, incremental, everyday, invisible, mundane, tedious works of love.
Yeah, and I can't help but feel we're all products of our culture. And, you and I have both lived since the 1950s onwards in the West, where the whole idea of celebrity has just exploded. And so the grand and the idea of spectacle's been around even longer. But it's
Yes.
really probably reached its zenith in our age. So it. I remember thinking about this before, and certainly this has come up in a lot of biblical texts, that it's actually converge to the wisdom of this world. It's almost impossible to estimate how meaningful it is in our walk with God to carry out multiple acts of service that are seemingly insignificant, one after the other. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's so interesting that you picked up on that. It's certainly, that's been a part of my journey too, is learning to accept that and be an insignificant pastor for the rest of my life. Hey, who cares if we get to preach the gospel and bring people into faith and build them up in the faith? Job done.
Well, I just want to say, like, I see the work of local pastors. I see it in my own church. I see it, previous, when I would have an opportunity to travel and meet people who do the regular work of ministry, like just the day in, the day out work of ministry. Don't show, like, I honestly feel like it's kind of easy to just show up, like, give your talk, leave, whatever. Or, whatever, if you're a social media influencer, like, get out there, post your nice picture and your pithy thought. But you know what? Local pastors like you are carrying, like, the work of ministry, the housekeeping, the kind of regular, ordinary, everyday acts of service. I actually think those are far more meaningful. And, to kind of go back to the seed parable, that resembles seeds, I think, more than some of the cosmic, dramatic, really sort of visible gestures. Because you think about seeds, they're small.
Mm.
They don't seem to be working very miraculously or powerfully, but before you know it, you wake up and a whole field has sprouted.
And I actually have found in my short ministry so far, I was saying to you, I've only been doing this about a year, having been ordained. Some of the most meaningful encounters so far have been when someone comes back and says, "Oh, you said this little one thing one day, and it stuck with me, and I built on it, and I added to it." And you're like, "Man, there really is nothing like ordinary ministry."
Yes.
But because you strayed into the territory of the church there, what would you say have been, given your reflections on the meaning of home generally and housekeeping, how has that shaped and affected your view of the church?
It may even be that my church has shaped and affected my view of home. Until we moved to Toronto, I would say that I had a very sort of kind of disembodied, displaced kind of idea of faith. And then we moved to Toronto, and our church tagline or whatever is we're a church in the city for the city. And that is not just kind of lip service that they pay to place. Every Sunday, a part of our liturgy is praying for the city. And that means you have to have read your paper or listened to your local radio, or you have to kind of know that the teachers are on strike, or that the premier is considering this initiative, or you have to know your place in order to pray for it. And I honestly think it's more that the church has shaped my view of home. And I also think one of the things I'm super grateful for is living in a city and attending a church where married couples with children are not the major demographic. And so it does cause you to kind of reach beyond sort of the cultural narrative of home, like where I came from in the suburbs of Chicago. Home, like home, that means like you got your 2.3 kids and you drive a minivan and you live on the cul-de-sac and, whatever in the suburbs. And that's absolutely like not a vision that can make sense for, half of the people who attend my church, who might want to be married, but they're not, or who might want to have children, but they're not, or who are transplanted here from somewhere, from lots of different countries. And so I feel like being here in Toronto caused me to ask deeper questions about home, to sort of reach beyond my own experience of home and say, because if the gospel is good news, it's got to be good news for everybody. It can't just be good news for people who are married. It can't just be good news for people who have children. It can't just be, good news for people who have these kind of perfect sort of picture perfect lives. It has to be good news for people who struggle with same-sex attraction, people who are divorced, people who have prodigal children, people who, are unemployed. Like, it has to be good news for everyone. And I really think it is. And so being in Toronto has caused me to sort of see people who live very differently than I do, and to say, like, okay, so what's the story of home for them? Mm-hmm. And the story of home for them, is that, as you said, like, God has come to make a home with his people. We have a God who has, that's the whole story of the Bible. It's God like made a garden for his people and he shared it with them. He made his home with them. And then when they despised his gifts of hospitality and preferred autonomy to his company, like, he continued to seek and save the homesick. And I think that is just so incredibly beautiful. I don't want to tell people like that I have the fullest experience of home just because I'm married with children, and have a house. No, that's not the good news of home. So I don't know. Those are some thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, that's really powerful. What a radical vision for church as well. That, and also what I love about what you're saying is that we don't actually need to work to make the gospel any more radical or inclusive than it already is, because that invite does go out to all. And if it's not embracing all, then the problem is we haven't worked enough to tease out that in our own theology.
That's right.
If people are excluded from the invite to come and sit and find out how God wants to make a home with them.
Yes.
Yeah. Jen, I just want to ask you about one more thing, because another one of your books is actually on my to-read list that I'm looking forward to reading next, is Surprised by Paradox. And I guess, I suppose, rather than, I would love to have another hour-long conversation, but I won't put you through that. You've been very kind in staying this long. But to ask something very focused, that I grew up very much in an evangelical culture where, the real emphasis was on perhaps the correct answers, and the Bible as the grid and the rule book, and almost all of that. I would still, I'm confessional Christian. I believe that God has revealed a lot of things to us very clearly. But in reading the synopsis for your book, and why I'm looking forward to reading it so much, is what about the ambiguity? How have you come to wrestle with that so much so that you wanted to write a book about that, and how is that relevant for our world today in trying to interpret the Bible in it?
Yeah, initially the book started out as a book on mystery, because I was really drawn to those places. I think it's a function of maybe just age and having walked with Jesus for 30 years. You're in your early 30s and I'm in my mid 40s. And, there are a lot of things that I used to think were just so clear and like unequivocal. And then I'm like, wait, hold on. Life doesn't always kind of end up as tidy as we wish it were. And so I wanted to just kind of draw into that like idea of mystery and really a posture of humility. I think just being able to say they're just God's ways are not my ways, his thoughts are not my thoughts, and they're just things I just don't understand. And so but what I came to see is that it actually was less about mystery and even less about ambiguity. It was about a different kind of certainty, but it's a certainty that's the both and, not the certainty of the either or. And so there actually is a little bit of uncertainty in the certainty. And you could even think about keeping place as an exploration of paradox, because it's both the home that we have here and now and the home that we're looking forward to. And you and I were kind of sharing that we had a bit of an either or proposition growing up with home. And I certainly did, growing up, it was like, well, if you think too much about your home now, then you're not thinking enough about your eternal home. So you have to constantly say, this world isn't my home, so that you can focus on the world that will be your home. But then you're like, but what do I do with like all of my everyday earthly responsibilities? Like, it leaves you a little bit unsure of just how to reconcile those two. And so I think Surprised by Paradox is a look at these kind of both and propositions. So we could both that home here and now is important, and the home that we have to inherit is eternal and unfading, and worthy of all of our time and attention and devotion. And I don't really obviously talk about that in the book, but like here would be an example of which I think ties in. I talk about the theme of lament. I think one of the things that Christians like really struggle to do is to hold in tension the idea of grief and hope at the very same time. And you think about like COVID right now, we're all having to do that. And we wouldn't be bearing, witness to reality as it is if we said, this isn't really that bad. If we didn't articulate the grief of this moment, there are real losses that we have to kind of name and articulate. And it's okay. That's not anti-faith, to name grief, because lament is this category that allows us to hold grief and hope at the very same time, as the psalmist did, like, why, God, have you forsaken me? And how long, O Lord? And yet will I trust in you. And so to think about, just our hope in this moment, we know that suffering in this world, it will finally be ended. There is coming a day when every tear will be dried and all pain and suffering and death itself will be put under the feet of Jesus Christ. That day is not yet, so we're sort of straining toward it, but also kind of bearing witness to the world as we have it now. And so that's kind of what the book does. It invites us to hold things that are true, that seem contradictory, to hold them in tension and to give them equal weight. And when we do that, I think we do come into a posture of humility and wonder, and maybe a mindset of like a constant learner, a pilgrim. Those are some of the things that I'm hoping for will happen in that book.
Yeah. Well, it's, clear from reading your book that you have had a pilgrimage thus far. And it is my hope that for anyone tuning into the conversation tonight, they'll either be excited to start on a pilgrimage with God, or they will be so encouraged and excited about just how significant their own pilgrimage is, and their own everyday and ordinary and housekeeping and all of that. So Jen, I want to thank you on behalf of the church for spending time with us. I want to thank you for putting the work in to write this book. It's incredible, and I don't mind giving you another plug. It's called Keeping Place. It's available on all online good bookstores, and so is Surprised by Paradox, I believe, even in our country. Mm-hmm. So Jen, thank you so much for being with us, and God bless you.
Thank you, David.